What's up, everybody? This is the Booch, and welcome to episode 4 of the Boochcast reviews Darkside of the Ring. This week, we've got a big topic to cover with you guys, and this is definitely going to be one of the most emotional episodes we have. There's a lot of episodes that are going to be emotional and tug at your heartstrings. I know last week's episode was definitely falling in that category, but this one does as well, especially if you have a family. You know, if you're a parent, you have kids, this is definitely going to mess with you. As this week, we're going to be covering the last of the Von Erichs. So basically, the Von Erichs were a wrestling family dynasty. In fact, they were often compared to the Kennedys. They were considered the Kennedys of professional wrestling in that they have two legacies. The legacy that was portrayed to the world and the dark side that got revealed later. No pun intended. They were one of the biggest attractions in the wrestling business. They were one of the biggest wrestling families in history because a lot of wrestling families and dynasties in the business, and the Von Erichs were one of them. And by many, they were considered to be a cautionary tale. Basically, a prime example of what not to do. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a very emotional episode. But there was one aspect of this that made me laugh my ass off. And of course, that came from Jim Cornette. Because at one point in this episode, he says, and I quote, "I've loved the wrestling business all my life, but it's not that important." I'm going to repeat that one more time for the people in the back. Jim Cornette, a man who is obsessed with the business, who holds the business near and dear to his heart, to the point where he shits on modern wrestling for not respecting the business. He has literally flipped his shit in multiple wrestling promotions because of the love he has for this business. He has a hatred for Vince Russo because of how he's handled the business. And in one episode, I'm not going to say which one it is, but at least not right now. I'll mention it later. At one point, he actually says, wrestling has been the most important thing in my life. So to hear him say it in this episode, especially when I know he's going to be saying it later in another episode, the exact opposite, was fucking hilarious to me. Jim Cornette saying the business is not that important was hilarious to me and hypocritical because Jim Cornette literally treats the business like it's his child because he doesn't have kids of his own. And I'm not knocking him for it. You know, hey, if you don't want to have kids, you don't want to have kids. I'm not exactly looking to have a family anytime soon either. But I'm just saying, you know, I thought that was very hypocritical of Cornette to say that. And also fucking hilarious. Now, in this docu episode, Kevin Von Erich is the one who was interviewed in this because he is the last surviving brother of this legendary family. So they call this episode The Last of the Von Erichs because Kevin Von Erich is the last one. Out of this entire legendary family, he is the last surviving brother. Everyone else is dead. His father is dead. His brothers are dead. His mom, I'm not so sure, but if she is, she probably died of old age. But, yeah. And you see the emotion that Kevin goes through in this. It's insane. You know, and he says he's happy to be away from wrestling, and he loves where he lives in Hawaii. He considers himself the luckiest man in the world. He loved his brothers. They loved him. And he said, but he is at peace now and isn't hurting. So obviously, at the time that he was taped for Darkside of the Ring, he's now at peace. He no longer has anger or bitterness, but he says he's happy to be away from wrestling. And after hearing this story, I can't say that I blame him. You know, if the wrestling business did to me what it did to him and his family, like the pressure and everything, I want to be away from the business too. So I hold no ill will towards Kevin for wanting to be away from the business. And then, of course, it talks about Fritz von Erich, who is the patriarch of this family, or was at the time. His father, he was the father of all these kids, was a vicious wrestler. He was a bad guy and believed if you're going to be a heel, be the best. And to him, nothing was more despicable than a Nazi. So he wrestled with a Nazi gimmick while beating up the Americans, like the American baby faces. And he was a huge star in the 50s and 60s. And he was the most hated wrestler in his prime. And, you know, I'm not going to lie, in the 50s and 60s, or during that time, you know, even though in 1945 World War II was over, people still, you know, had hatred towards the Nazis. Hell, we're in 2021. People still hate Nazis. The only difference is in the 50s and 60s, they hated actual Nazis, as opposed to today, where the word Nazi gets thrown around so much, you don't even have to be German to be called one, which I think is kind of fucked up. But anyway, his kids cheered their dad, but also knew if others cheered, that was bad for him. So obviously, because they're his kids, they loved him, but they knew that others could not cheer for him because he's a heel. And that is what a true heel understands. And that's a key thing for, you know, wrestlers to think about. You know, if your job is to be a bad guy, your job is to get that audience to hate you. If they're cheering you, you suck at your job as a bad guy. And you do whatever you have to do to get your heat. In most cases. The only thing you're not allowed to do is if the promoter, the guy paying you money, tells you you can do this but not this, or go this far but not that far. Obviously listen to the promoter because he's the one that's paying you money at the end of the night. So what he says goes. But you work within the parameters to get your heat. And also, he was the guy who invented the Iron Claw, which every Von Erich fan knows is the finishing move. In fact, it was passed down to all the kids. At some point, every member of the Von Erich family used that Iron Claw. And back then, wrestlers aspired to make enough money to buy a territory and become a promoter, because that's where the money is. And I know I mentioned that a little bit with Bruiser Brody in last week's show. So he founded, Fritz von Erich, World Class Championship Wrestling, WCCW, which if you grew up in Texas, that was the show to watch. That was wrestling for the Texas territory. And pretty much anybody that is, you know, a fan of classic wrestling, you've watched some WCCW matches at some point. In fact, a lot of the big name wrestlers of today, like the legends, even the current stars, well, I should say the legends because the current stars I don't think ever watched it unless it's on the network, but who grew up in Texas, you know, your Stone Colds, your Shawn Michaels, your Undertakers, they grew up watching World Class Championship Wrestling. And of course, Fritz wanted his kids to be stars to carry on the next generation. And that was interesting because Fritz von Erich, to my knowledge, is one of the few wrestling fathers. In fact, to my knowledge, he's the only one that actually wanted his kids to get into the business. Because almost every single wrestler that I'm aware of, none of them wanted their kids to get into the business. Hell, The Rock said that he had arguments with his dad when he wanted to get into the business because his dad said, "You're throwing your life away." But finally, when he could tell his son was going to do it, he finally let him do it because he said, I want you to train me. And if you're not going to train me, I'll find somebody else to do it. So when he realized he was going to do it no matter what, his dad finally said, all right, I'll train you, but only because I want you to learn the right way. Hell, I remember at one point, Hulk Hogan's son, Nick, wanted to get in the business. Hulk was against that. There's a lot of wrestlers who don't want their kids in the business because they know how bad it can be. You know, they don't want them to pick that life. So to see a dad who actually wanted his kids in the business, that was big to me because he's the only wrestling father that I know of that wanted his kids in the business. I'm not saying there aren't others. That's just the only one I ever saw. So I found that intriguing. And the kids wanted to be like their dad. And as tag teams, they had perfect chemistry because they were brothers. And they became instant household names. Kevin Von Erich, David Von Erich, Kerry Von Erich. Von Erich brothers came in during this time. They were household names. They were on 9 o'clock in the morning on Sunday mornings. They watched those guys on TV. And, of course, their biggest rivalries were with the Fabulous Freebirds, were the guys they feuded with the most. I know Chris Adams was another guy that feuded with the Von Erichs a lot. Ric Flair definitely had his fair share of matches with the Von Erichs. So, but they were, and of course they had other rivalries as well, but they were the top three. But the Fabulous Freebirds, they were the ones practically running WCCW. Like, literally it revolved around the Freebirds and the Von Erichs. That was the ultimate rivalry back in the day. Was those two, was those three-man teams and how epic they were. And then, of course, you know, and they covered it like a sporting event. That's how big it was in Texas. And they had cameraman and sound guys in the ring. They literally have cameramen by the ring, in the ring, sound guys doing stuff. And back then they had those big-ass cameras. Not like, I mean, granted, they still use big-ass cameras today, but they weren't as technologically sound as they are now. So they had the old school ones in there. And they started doing that before anybody else. WWF wasn't doing it back then. The other companies weren't doing it back then. Not Crockett, nobody. WCCW set the stage for what we saw today. So all the stuff we see in the business from a production standpoint that we all tend to take for granted, World Class Championship Wrestling started that. So it was great to get, you know, a little bit of that history lesson. And, of course, the ladies loved them. Women swooned over the Von Erich boys. They love them. People even made comic books about them, about the Von Erichs. They were beating up all these villains that were taking over the universe because their hearts are so good that they were able to beat all these bad guys. And they were teen idols and they were heartthrobs. Like, you know, women wanted them, men wanted to be them, and kids idolized them. Now, Kerry Von Erich was the main star of the Von Erich family. Out of all of them, he was the guy. He had the body and the charisma. And that was what he brought to the table. Then you had David Von Erich, who was the best performer in the ring with psychology. Like, he knew how to tell a story. He knew how to read people. He knew how to evoke emotion from the crowd. And he came out with a big yellow rose and was often called the Yellow Rose of Texas. And then you had Kevin Von Erich, who was the athlete of the group. He could do all the flips and the high spots and everything else. He wasn't a spot monkey, but he was the most athletic of the group. He did those moves, but again, he knew where to place them because he had the mindset to know how to do that. And then you had Mike and Chris, who were the smaller ones of the group. You know, they were kind of like the runts of the litter, as you would say. And what made them such great baby faces was they represented God, family, and country. Which, in some parts of the country today, might not be a big deal to people. But during that time in Texas, that's big. God, family, and country. Texas prides itself on those three things. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody in Texas who doesn't honor God, who doesn't honor family, and doesn't love their country, this country. You're hard-pressed. I'm not saying they don't exist, but they'd be hard to find in Texas. They were heroes. They were more popular than movie stars, and they were more accessible because they could literally be, the Von Erich kids would be walking down the street. People would see them, want to come up to them, ask for an autograph. They sign autographs, they take pictures. You could see them. It wasn't like the movie stars who live out in Hollywood, or when they're on movie sets in Texas, it's a closed set. You can't really get near them. The Von Erichs, you could see them at the mall. You could see them out. They'd be on magazine covers, and they'd be out hunting and fishing because they were Texas boys. They liked to go hunting. They liked to go fishing. They were country boys. Won school awards. It was talked about in the papers, like athletic awards or academic achievements. They grew up on TV and in the public eye. So even before they got into the business, like full throttle, they were the center of attention because of who their dad was. Now, David was poised to be a future world champion. Everyone thought that David was going to be the one to finally get the world title. But sadly, he died. And ironically, Bruiser Brody found the body. And the cause of death was acute enteritis, which is an inflammation of the intestines. So he had an infection. He was throwing up. He wasn't feeling well. But their dad always said, you make the shows you're booked at. Because that's a big thing with wrestlers, but it's also a big thing with men in general. And I've talked about this on previous videos that I've done on HVMA and on my personal YouTube channel, Vinny Bucci. I've talked about this where that's how men are. If you can physically get up and go to work, you take your ass to work. You get to work however you can. Now, the difference between wrestlers and regular workers is, even if you can't physically get out of bed as a wrestler, you still make the towns. Regular people, like if you're legit sick, like with a fever and a flu and you can't get out of bed, most cases, you know, in regular families, that would be like, all right, I can clearly see you're actually sick. Go back to bed. Let's get you some medicine. You'll be fine. In wrestling, you make the gigs you're booked at. That's a rule. You never no-show. And wrestlers do whatever they can not to no-show an event. Most men are like that too. Most men would rather go to work and have their boss look at them and say, you're too sick to work, go home, than call out. They'd rather just have somebody send them home because they clearly can't do the job. Because then it doesn't make you less of a man because your boss is telling you to stay home. All right, I'm still a man because I'm doing what the boss told me to do. My boss told me to do this. So it's a mental thing. It fucks with guys. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. I'm just saying that's how we were wired. But people tried to say that it was pills and they covered it up. Like a lot of people was controversial. They thought, he was taking pills and all that. And they thought that he died of a pill overdose and they were lying to cover it up. And it's like, no, it was inflammation of the intestines. Like it's documented. They have fucking, doctors who confirm that shit. And of course, American and Japanese fans were all hurting. The funeral had lots of wrestlers and fans there. There was anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 people at this funeral. Schools let out early to go to that funeral. The Texas legislature convened, came over there. Like, Texas hurt that day. Like, when David Von Erich died, the state of Texas stopped. The world didn't stop. Texas did. That's how well loved the Von Erichs were. They even had screens and speakers outside for people that couldn't get in. They had to install projectors because there weren't enough people to get into the church for the service. Kevin, to this day, said he still can't handle phone calls before daylight because obviously at some point there's going to be a spiraling out of control of, a lot of deaths in the Von Erich family. And as a result of that, Kevin is always scared when the phone rings. And at one point, Kevin had bad knees and couldn't play football. Like he was playing football, he injured his knees, and David used to say, "So I heard you're a quitter." And that was just David being a dick, and they were brothers, laughing. And Kevin finds it funny now, but obviously at the time, he didn't. But, and I like that because it kind of showed like, hey, that's how brothers are. That's just how brothers are. Like we make fun of each other, we ball bust each other. Sonny and I, we do that shit all the time. But, they're brothers and they love each other. We're brothers and we love each other. But anyway, Jackie was the oldest and lived in a trailer park. And Jackie came home from school and he was walking home in the snow and he tried to go around the tongue of the trailer and accidentally touched it. It electrocuted him. He fell face first in the snow and drowned in a puddle. So that's one tragic moment in the Von Erich family. And then, of course, they talk about at David's tribute show, they did a big tribute show for WCCW. They had Kerry Von Erich versus Ric Flair. And it was the biggest crowd in American wrestling history at that time. And they were competing for the NWA World title. And they thought for this match, Ric Flair has to drop the title to Kerry Von Erich. They got to make the title change and give the fans something great. And of course, Ric Flair, to his credit, was willing to make the title change. He was willing to do business. Kerry Von Erich got the win. The crowd went crazy. See the Von Erichs win the NWA World Heavyweight title was a very big deal. And then, of course, Fritz wanted Lance Von Erich to replace David. So they brought in Lance Von Erich. The only problem is the fans hated it because they knew he wasn't a real Von Erich. And the crowd felt lied to. And apparently, this decision started the downfall of the family legacy. It is now coming to a point where we're about to see this legacy come to an end. It started here. Because next, they bring in Mike, who was not cut out to be a wrestler. His name was all he had. He couldn't wrestle, and he didn't know how to work in the ring. Also, he had no size, and at one point in the match, he dislocated his shoulder, and he had a high fever of 105. He had a staph infection that escalated into toxic shock syndrome. And like I said, the Von Erichs were so well loved in Texas still, people offered to donate organs to help him. And at one point, Gary Holder, they're in the hospital bed. He slams a Bible on the table and says, "Keep your word, God." And all of a sudden, his temperature dropped. And 1 week later, they rolled him out of the hospital. People can argue whether or not that was divine intervention, but, like I said, they honor God. And if there is a God, he looked out for them for that. But he looked hollow. And apparently he raged from time to time. He was drunk driving a lot. He was getting possession over marijuana. And at one point, Mike missed an event. And like I said before, if you were a Von Erich, you didn't miss an event. But he missed the event because he was arrested. And Mike overdosed and committed suicide because he was depressed over being arrested and, embarrassing himself and the family name, and he committed suicide. Then, after Mike, came Chris Von Erich. He was the next to be called in. He had health problems. He didn't have a body like his brothers. And the problem is he had asthma and wasn't very athletic in the ring. And at one point, he broke his arm, so he couldn't even work out. And, of course, Chris is upset. He's depressed. They talked at one point in the documentary about him going to Kevin to get his VCR back. He called him about wanting his VCR back. Kevin said, "I'll give it to you tomorrow." Then Kevin and Chris talked. Apparently, he went out to some kind of forest or something. Wanted to check. He said, and he told Chris, "Are you going to kill yourself?" Kevin said no. Kevin believed him and then left and went home. Turns out Chris lied and shot himself in the head. So, and apparently he was heartbroken over the loss of Mike. That's what caused him to commit suicide. And it just gets heavy from that point on. And of course, their reputations take serious damage because they were God-fearing Texas All-Americans. So when skeletons started coming out of the closet, seats got more and more empty. Because now people are realizing that the Von Erich boys are not handling life very well. And things are getting more and more crazy. And it's just getting more depressing. And these guys were like, I don't know, mentally, I don't know if they had mental health problems like going into the business, but while they were in it, they definitely had some problems while in the business and I'm not saying the business can do that to you, but I'm just saying these guys, I don't know how mentally they were ready for the business. But after this, Kerry left to go work for the WWF with WCCW going down. He saw it as an opportunity to get on a bigger stage and make more money. And of course, he was wrestling as the Texas Tornado. And as the Texas Tornado, he did pretty good. At one point, I think he became the Intercontinental Champion, and held it for a while. Then, at one point, he hit the back of a parked police car, and his ankle got injured. It looked like an alligator chewed on it. He had an amputation, but he kept it a secret. He didn't want people to know that he had a flaw. But and even though he performed well, he mentally felt like a fake. Everybody was telling him to keep it a secret, and he felt like a fake and a fraud, which made no sense to me personally. But again, I'm not in Kerry's head. But I was like, dude, you're performing well with an amputated leg. And I don't understand why in the business Kerry had a problem keeping it a secret. The whole concept of the wrestling business is to keep things a secret. That's essentially what kayfabe is. You're keeping things secret from the fans. I figure as a wrestler, if you're already keeping secrets, like making people believe you hate the other person in the ring, why would you have a hard time keeping a secret about an amputated limb? You did what you had to do to get back in the ring. I'm sure if the fans knew, it wouldn't have hurt his image, but I don't think keeping it a secret should hurt you either. And eventually he had to stop doing the Iron Claw. I think that was a WWF related thing. Then at one point he started partying and doing pills, and of course got arrested. And at one point, Kevin was on the phone with Kerry, and Kerry said he was thinking about killing himself, and Kevin said, "Don't do that to me." They said, let's just get away for a bit. We'll go on vacation and we'll have some fun. So they went to Alaska with 44s to go hunting. Kerry hugged his dad, took off in the Jeep. Fritz found the Jeep parked and found the body. And it turns out Kerry had shot himself in the heart, and they said he had a peaceful moment on his face. Like he felt happy. And once again, it was insane. He said he wanted to follow his late brothers and that they were calling out to him or something. Like it got sick. Like the Von Erich boys were not holding it well together. And, that's the worst thing. Like you have 2 or 3 brothers that have already committed suicide. You're telling your other brother about killing himself. Kevin's saying, "Don't do that to me," and it happens anyway. Like that's fucked up. And it shows that, sometimes with suicide, you can do your best to help the other person or talk the other person out of it, but at the end of the day, you can't feel guilty if somebody does that. Because if a person really wants to kill themselves, they're gonna find a way. And you can do your best to try to stop them, but if you do your best and it happens anyway, you got to know that you did your best to help them. And you can't let that pain carry around forever. But, of course, things get even crazier. At this point, the mom of the Von Erichs, Fritz's wife, leaves him because she starts blaming him for the death of the kids. And towards the end of Fritz's life, he had brain cancer. And at one point, he got into a heated argument with Kevin. And he pointed the gun at Kevin and said, "You'd kill yourself too if you had the guts." Kevin said, "Dad, it takes guts to live." And he says, "Quit pointing the gun at me." And they're yelling back and forth. He tells him to put the gun down. And, eventually at that point, Kevin left. And then eventually, his dad died of cancer. And Kevin said that he was glad when his dad died because he was suffering so much and that now the suffering was over. And I guess Kevin could handle it a lot better because when his dad died, it wasn't by suicide, it was cancer. And then Kevin at one point had one moment where he thought about killing himself. And he tells the story. He said he went into a gun store and he grabbed a rifle and he like tried to hide it, like tucked it in, and just walked out of the store. Nobody noticed he had it. And as he's walking out of the store with this gun, because he felt at that point, nobody loved him, nobody cared about him, and that, you know, his life was basically over. And he stole the gun, and the men in there looked at him and said, "Love you, Kev." That's all he said. And he goes to his car. He looks at the gun, changes his mind, goes back in the store, gives back the rifle, puts it back on the desk, and says, "I love you too, sir." And then he starts crying, and all the guys in the store, they put their arms around Kevin, they hugged him. They didn't even press charges because they knew the mental state he was in. Like they didn't press charges. They just said, "Look, we love you, we care about you." And I think just Kevin knowing that somebody cared enough to say that to him was enough. And sometimes that is enough. You know, most people, when they get that depressed, they feel like nobody loves or cares about them. So sometimes letting that person know that you love and care about them is enough to talk a person out of doing something like that. And again, it was this whole documentary took you on an emotional roller coaster with the Von Erichs. And it definitely makes me want to watch classic Von Erich matches. Like at some point, I might go watch some world-class championship wrestling just because I want to see the good side of the Von Erichs instead of just the depressing side that we got in here. But again, that was the theme, the last of the Von Erichs. And this is Darkside of the Ring. So they're going to give you the dark side. And towards the end, they show Kevin sitting in a tree that he calls his office. And he talks about how he's now at a point in his life where he feels happy and peaceful. He has a family. And he has two sons, Marshall and Ross Von Erich, who are currently wrestlers. And right now, currently, they have a multi-year contract with MLW, which is Major League Wrestling. And, of course, they have another girl, Lacey Von Erich, who is Kerry Von Erich's daughter. She's wrestled for WWE, and she was even in TNA, where she was a Knockouts Tag Team Champion, and she retired in 2010. When I heard that Ross and Marshall were wrestlers, I'm not going to lie to you. I was fucking shocked. Because obviously Fritz wanted his kids to get in the business. I don't understand how Kevin Von Erich, and again, I'm not trying to badmouth the business. I just find it fascinating. With everything Kevin went through and the family tragedies he suffered, to allow your sons to compete in the business, that takes a lot of balls. Like, I don't know if maybe he's confident in the fact that he raised his sons to have a stronger head on their shoulders, or maybe they made a bunch of promises like, don't get involved in this, don't get involved in this. If you're having any problems, call me. You know, do something to not go down the road that his brothers went down. I respect the hell out of Kevin Von Erich for being able to allow his kids to wrestle. Because if I was Kevin and I went through all that, I don't know if I let my kids in the business. I mean, like I said, that's if I was a Von Erich. Obviously, if I had kids, I wouldn't have a problem necessarily letting them in the business, because even though I've had some bad moments in the business, they weren't as bad as what the Von Erichs went through. So I can sympathize with that. But to allow his kids to wrestle amazes me. And I definitely want to see how good they are. And I know that Kevin wrestled alongside his two sons in Israel in his last match. He made like a cameo appearance where they competed in a 6-man tag, and he used the Iron Claw to beat somebody in the ring. And Kevin got to, have that farewell moment with his sons, which is great. And they also show his sons, and they are built like brick shit houses. They train in Hawaii. They practice all the time. They train. They're like really good from what I can see. And obviously they signed a multi-year contract with MLW. So if I ever come across them in MLW, I would love to see how good they are now. And if they live up to the Von Erich name as far as wrestling goes. And of course, in 2009, the Von Erich family was inducted into the Hall of Fame as a group, the whole family. And of course, Michael P.S. Hayes of the Freebirds inducted them, and Kevin Von Erich accepted the induction. So Kevin Von Erich has a Hall of Fame ring, and I'm glad he does. And I'm glad that he had that ring to represent his family. And to me, that speaks high volumes. And that is a great, great thing to know that they got to have the recognition that they deserve as being one of the greatest wrestling families of all time. Despite all the tragedy, despite all the craziness, they are still a dynasty in wrestling. And like I said, they're also a cautionary tale of what not to do. And I think you can learn lessons, good and bad, from the Von Erichs. And that would be an advice I would give to anybody in the business. When you study the Von Erichs, don't just study them to know what to do. Study them to know what not to do. And don't let the business consume you the way it consumed all of them. And if you're thinking about committing suicide, get some help. Like, whether it's calling a hotline or talking to a friend or a family member. Because in the immortal words of Kevin Hines, it's okay to not be okay. It's not okay to not ask for help. Somebody close to you will help you. There is somebody who loves and cares about you enough that they are worth living for. And that's something we all have to remember when we have moments where we want to commit suicide. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wrap up this episode of Darkside of the Ring. Thank you guys so much for checking this out. Make sure you guys tune in next week for episode 5. We got a great one for you guys. It's going to be the mysterious death of gorgeous Gino. That's right. We're going to talk about Gino Hernandez. I can't wait to get into this one. It's my personal favorite of all the episodes, and I'll explain why next week. Also, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and ring that bell to be notified so you never miss another episode of the Boochcast reviews, Darkside of the Ring, as well as other Boochcast-related YouTube content. Make sure you are following us on SoundCloud, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Twitch, support the show through Patreon. You guys know the spiel by now. And I'll talk to you guys next week. Until then, pizza, baby!